From the banks of the Colorado River in Lake Mead to the homes and businesses in southern Nevada, welcome to Water Smarts, the podcast pumping from the heart of Las Vegas, where we engage with the experts who keep the water flowing throughout southern Nevada. I'm Bronson Mack.
And I'm Crystal Zuelke. From how we treat it, deliver it, use it, protect it, and conserve it, the Water Smarts podcast is all about water in southern Nevada. We hope to make you a little smarter about the one thing that keeps us all connected: water.
Crystal, good to see you today. You doing okay?
I am, although, it's already been a year. It's still early in 2025, but my goodness, it feels like the world is on fire. Literally, there's a lot happening. So I'm excited about our topic today, which I know you're going to introduce here in a minute, but it's just different from what we normally do, and it's a little bit more happy and uplifting and fun to talk about.
Yeah, we talk a lot about water. We talk a lot about water infrastructure. We've talked a lot about drought. You just referenced fire with those horrible fires in Southern California affecting so many people in Los Angeles. Yeah, I agree with you. It's good to engage in maybe a little lighter conversation today because we're going to get into it a little bit here. And while water is a connection, we're going to talk more about species. And more particular, we're going to talk about a very small fish and a very unique frog. And we're going to do that here because today we have Dr. Ray Saumure. And Ray is an environmental biologist with the Southern Nevada Water Authority, and he has been instrumental in helping restore some of the native habitat located at the Springs Preserve through the Las Vegas Creek Restoration Project. And that is helping two very rare species. One is a fish, one is an amphibian. Ray, welcome to the Water Smarts podcast.
Hi, Bronson, Crystal. I'm super excited as a biologist to tell you guys about the project.
We are really excited to hear about it. So we want to dig right in here, Ray. I'm not a biologist, but I definitely enjoyed my biology classes at CSN when I was taking them at CSN. So I can really appreciate what you're doing. I did.
Did you really?
I loved it. I loved the lab. Yes. Owl pellets, all of that. It was great. But Ray, we're not here to talk about my education. We're here to talk about two projects in particular that were part of the Las Vegas Creek Restoration Project. And you and several other researchers have recreated what is an aquatic habitat at the Springs Preserve and introduced the endangered Pahrump Poolfish and the rare Relict Leopard frog into those areas. But before we dive into that project, can you just give us a little bit of background on the Springs Preserve and why this site was even selected for this project?
So going back quite a ways, the Springs Preserve was originally, the whole area was a wetland going back 10, 13,000 years ago. There were Columbian mammoths and ground sloths and all kinds of animals like that. And as the ice sheets receded, the Mojave Desert formed. So we ended up with these little springs, these remnant springs. And those particular areas created this habitat. And that became sort of a meadow. And it was about 6 miles long. The only portion of that section that is left is the Springs Preserve. And there were 3 main springs at the Springs Preserve. Those springs flowed, they were going like gangbusters for quite a while until just sometime prior to 1962 with just the development in Las Vegas and groundwater pumping. The water stopped having enough pressure to flow to the surface. There's still groundwater down there, but it just can't reach the surface anymore. So as you can imagine, in the desert, water is life. So if you lose water, you're going to lose biodiversity. We lost, some snails, the fish and frog we were talking about earlier, and just that whole thing that it sort of collapses the system. So what we've been working on since about 2003 is restoring the Springs Preserve, and some of that was the terrestrial habitat, but we also worked on restoring the Las Vegas Creek or portions thereof. Because we can't have water flowing from groundwater from the springs anymore, we recreated pond systems where we could focus on putting surrogate species in the ponds to replace those that were lost.
So I love these projects, Ray, because a lot of people still don't know the history of the Springs Preserve, even though it's been there for about 18 years now. And some of these projects we'll be talking about today as restoring part of our natural history that was lost decades ago. And for those that haven't been to the Springs, you can see these living research projects along the trails at the Cienega and in Cottonwood Grove, where part of the historic Las Vegas Creek flows again thanks to these restoration projects. So, Ray, let's back up with some of these definitions before we kind of get deeper into this. Let's talk about what cienega is and what is rewilding.
Right. So a cienega, historically, they were valley bottom wetlands, a little bit different than a swamp. There were no trees, but they were just like giant seeps where water was seeping up everywhere and creating these very specific plant communities. So the soils are very alkali, so only certain species will grow there. And because of the specific habitat, then there was only certain species that were specific to these habitats. So you ended up with these large wetlands, but over time, again, due to groundwater pumping and stuff, a lot of the cienegas of today, well, there's only about 5% of them left. 95% of them were destroyed over time and pumped for primarily agriculture, but it can be invasive species growing in them, that kind of thing as well. So with the loss of all these, the ones that are left tend to be incised and they might just be one spring. So you have a spring seeping up, there's a little meadow next to it. And in fact, that's where the term Las Vegas comes from, meadow in Spanish. So these kinds of habitats, we recreated one down in the Meadows Detention Basin at the Springs Preserve. And then rewilding, going back to these springs being isolated 10 to 13,000 years ago, rewilding has several definitions. So for some people, it can be as simple as I removed my lawn and I planted indigo bushes and mesquite trees, and that you're rewilding, you're bringing back the native species that can be frequented. I know my yard has quail and roadrunners and sometimes desert cottontail rabbits, a lot of native species coming back because you've put the native plants back. Now, that's a very simple definition. Another, a little bit one step above that, is where people are rewilding. Like in the news these days, very recently, they're rewilding wolves into Colorado. In other places, it's bison. And we've also realized the importance of species like beaver to ecosystems. So that's another form of rewilding. And what we're doing is more Pleistocene rewilding. So what we're looking at is we had species isolated in these springs, and these springs have been isolated by the Mojave Desert around them for thousands of years. So those species were lost, and we're trying to just rewild them by using a surrogate species to get it back to the ecosystem functioning properly.
Okay, so Ray, let's talk about then the Pahrump Poolfish rewilding that was part of a project that you had been working on, you and your team. The Pahrump Poolfish are a federally endangered species, and your team has introduced them to the ponds you restored and created at the Springs Preserve. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project?
This particular fish was isolated to a single spring called Man Spring in Pahrump. And back in the day, a professor at UNLV realized that groundwater pumping was threatening this fish. Dr. Deacon got a bucket of fish and saved them, and he put them in a refugium, an area of refuge where the fish could persist. That wasn't their native location. And that project eventually grew into the Springs Preserve. So we did the same thing. We obtained about 290 Pahrump poolfish in 2018 and put them in reconstructed ponds that we had built at the Springs Preserve. The Pahrump poolfish, to those that have never seen one, are tiny little fish, maybe 2 to 3 inches, most of them. You get some slightly larger ones. They're more like what most people would consider a minnow. They're federally endangered, again, because their one habitat was basically wiped out. So the restoration plan is that we should have 3 population of Pahrump poolfish with at least 500 adults maintained for several years in a row before they can be delisted. The Springs Preserve adds to that by adding another population to this growing conservation project. What we've been doing is when we put the fish into the ponds, they immediately reproduce. So that was pretty awesome for us. And I did the very big mistake of saying this is going to be easy with the Pahrump poolfish, because they went from 290 fish when we first put them in May of 2018 to about 365 fish. And I was like, this is going to be a piece of cake. What ended up happening was the following year and subsequent years, the fish population started decreasing just a little bit every year, but it was going down and down. And we went from that high, like 290 to 365, and then all the way down to about 100 fish. So my issue was, what changed? Why did they start declining? And so we looked, and what you want to do in science is pick one thing and try and figure out what one thing changed. And there was several things that changed One of which is when we first created the ponds, there wasn't a lot of vegetation or algae in them when we first set them up and put the fish in. And we ended up with stonewort, a type of macroalgae that looks more like a plant than an algae. And it ultimately filled the ponds from the bottom of the pond right up to the water surface. The fish seemed to be doing okay in there. You could see them darting in and out, and it protected them from birds of prey and whatnot. We thought, well, maybe that's one thing we could change. Let's remove this macroalgae. And there were hundreds of pounds of this stuff. It's very thick. It was a mat. If you threw like a minnow trap or something at the surface of the water, it wouldn't have even sunk. It was so thick. So we had some of our folks clear all that out. And in that first year, we had a bump of 25% within just a couple of months. So when we did a survey in July with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we were all surprised, like, oh, this is working, but it's only been a couple of months. Let's give it another year. So we kept removing the chara for an entire year. And lo and behold, the next year, when we did the survey in July, the population jumped up 504%. So it was like through the roof. We were up to over 800 fish. The reason I had selected removing the chara was because I had read some papers on razorback suckers and other fish. And as it turns out, dragonflies will deposit their larvae, so they have an aquatic phase of their life cycle, and you get these little things that look like animals almost from the movie Aliens, and they have this protruding jaw that goes out, and it turns out that most of the time they're on the bottom of the pond, and that's where the large adult fish are down at the bottom, and those fish are too big for the dragonfly larvae to eat, but the fish can eat baby dragonfly larvae, so that was working originally. But then with the chara growing all the way up to the surface, at the surface was where all the little fish fry, the little fish larvae live, right up at the top. And so the dragonfly larvae were able to climb up the vegetation to the top and then hunt and wipe out our recruitment. They're about 96% efficient. Within like a small amount of time, they were taking away all our recruitment. And you might say, well, the adults will live, but most of the adult fish only live about 2 years, 2 to 4 years max, so that they don't have a long life cycle. So we were having no recruitment in the pond. So that's why our population kept going down and down and down. But as soon as we removed the ability of the dragonfly larvae to get at the baby fish at the surface by removing the plants, the population exploded. So that was how we solved that problem. So we're pretty excited about getting it under control and figure out what was going on.
Wow. I mean, that's just amazing that you were able to understand and analyze what the issue was, take a corrective action there. And since you've done that, now these fish are thriving. I mean, that just feels like stars being aligned, or is this just science?
It's trial and error sometimes. You got to figure out, like, what could it be? Another alternative at the time was we have some frogs in there, and they have very large tadpoles, and the tadpoles can be eating the fish eggs as well. So was that a concern? But ultimately, we had to pick one. If you make a whole bunch of changes and then it goes up, then you have no idea what was it that fixed it. So that's why we were like, okay, what's the most likely cause? And based on the literature I read, it seems like removing this plant might be the ticket for us. We got lucky on the first try, and it was. So we're pretty excited, actually. So.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, that's a huge success story just in and of itself. Now, you mentioned the frog, and we haven't talked about the frogs yet. And so I want to get to the frogs. Being somebody who, when I was a kid, spending, summers in Utah or Idaho and going up and down the creeks and the rivers, frogs were what we were always looking for if we didn't have a fishing pole in our hand. So I want to hear a little bit about these frogs. You introduced the Relict leopard frog. Could you just talk a little bit about what that introduction of that species was like?
So what we did is some of our colleagues, they got egg masses from the wild and raised up the tadpoles in captivity and brought us in the first year metamorphs. So these newly transformed frogs, about an inch long, and we released them in the pond. We had about 100 of them. So they're swimming around in the pond, but they've been raised in captivity, and they're used to being fed crickets from the surface. So they're all floating around, and they see all these people, and we're all taking photos, and look, the frogs are back at the Springs Preserve. And lo and behold, this pair of mallards comes by, and the female mallard, she really needs to shell up her eggs. She needs a lot of calcium, and we didn't know, but they're a source of calcium for ducks trying to shell up their eggs. So she just went through and started gobbling up these frogs right in front of us. So that was pretty stressful. And as the summer progressed, we were seeing less and less frogs, and the pair of ducks were coming up every day. And it's a preserve, so that's nature. That's the way it goes. By August, we only had 6 frogs that we knew of left. And then by, I think it was October, we were down to 4 frogs. So even though I thought the frogs were going to be easy, it turned out that we we're going to have a problem there. Luckily, it was 1 male and 3 females. So the following year, they actually reproduced. And what was absolutely fantastic is when they were released in May, they were 1 inch long. And by October, we were getting frogs that were probably closer to I'd say about 4 inches long from their snout to their butt. The amount of growth that they can do in a year is phenomenal. And we ended up with record-sized frogs at the Springs Preserve. So those 4 frogs that were left over, they had unlimited food around the ponds. We had Africanized bees coming in to get water for their hive to do evaporative cooling, and they were eating the bees. We actually have video of one frog getting tagged on the tongue by a bee and then jumping, swimming around in circles and sinking the bottom, and actually died almost instantly from a bee sting. You can imagine how much a bee sting hurts for us. So you imagine if you're a little tiny frog and you get stung in the mouth, it's lethal. So that's something we ended up publishing on both the diet that a frog would eat an invasive species like Africanized bees, and just that they can die from it too. Another thing we discovered is when we were doing our surveys, we catch a lot of large frogs and small frogs, and we have them in buckets. And although it had been suspected for a while, it had never been observed, but one of the somewhat larger frogs actually snapped up one of the little frogs, and we took some photos, and that's another upcoming publication. And that's super important to actually document, because the fact that they're cannibalistic means it controls our population to a certain extent. We have so many frogs now at the ponds. The population in the first year was 4 in 2018, then it was 12, and then the following year it went up to 40, and then we got up to 66 frogs. So that, at that amount in those ponds, if you've been to the ponds, they're not huge. But what ends up happening is there's adult frogs camped out all over the place. And when the little guys start to transform from tadpoles into froglets and they're hopping around, the adults are just snapping them up. They're little frog cookies, so they self-control their own population. When we have a lot of adults, when the population is, say, at 66 adults with an estimate of up to 100 adult frogs around the ponds, we catch less juveniles that year because they've been eating the juveniles. And these frogs also only live about 2 years. So every couple of years, we have they die off just naturally. So the population will go from, say, 66 to 40, then back up to 60. And the reason it's yo-yoing is the demographics of the population. They go up and down. And so in the years where we have the lowest number of adults, we have way more juveniles. And another thing that will control that whole variability in how many frogs we have is because they're cannibalistic, the little guys are sitting around, they're like, man, this is dangerous. My aunt and uncle are going to eat me if I stick around this pond much longer. And if we get a rain event in the fall, we get rain-assisted dispersals. The Springs Preserve most of the time is way too dry. Frogs just can't survive sort of fording across the desert to try and find a new habitat. When we get a rain event in those years, a lot of the little guys are like, we're out of here. And they're going to take their chances, and they head off across the Springs Preserve. And some of those are ending up down in the Cienega, which originally we didn't put any frogs. But a few years ago, we decided we had so many tadpoles in the ponds. We did a survey in July for Pahrump Poolfish, and we caught 1,200 tadpoles, which was like, if these all transform, it's going to be like plague proportions here. So we moved a couple of hundred tadpoles down into the Cienega. We didn't catch a lot of frogs. We caught one the first year and none the second year. But it turns out if you have a big depression like the Meadows Detention Basin where the Cienega is, cold air tends to accumulate down there. So they were going dormant sooner. Even though we thought it wasn't working, and I was kind of bummed, and I was like, why is this not working? This should be working. It turned out what we did is instead of doing the survey in September or October, we did it in August. And all of a sudden, the first year we caught 23 frogs, and the next year we caught, I think it was 48 frogs, and giant frogs again. So that was kind of interesting too, is the size of these frogs in the first year were really big. We literally published a paper showing we had the biggest of these frogs ever recorded. And the reason they were getting so big is less competition. And so it was the same thing when they moved down the Cienega, there was a huge, much, much larger wetland and few frogs. So the frogs are all getting 84 millimeters in that almost 5-inch category. So they're getting really, really big down there because there's less competition. But the Cienega is a little bit different. It has a lot of predators down there. We have coyotes going down by there and herons and egrets and all of that. So we're pretty excited that they're surviving and getting ginormous, as we'd say, down there in the Cienega. Now we have these two populations of this rare frog. And to give you an idea, this frog, there's only about 1,600 of them on the planet. So, people talk about elephants and this species and that species being endangered, and a lot of those species still measure in the tens of thousands. So discovering that they can grow really large and that they're cannibalistic, these were key important observations that we added to the biology of the species. If you open a textbook on frogs and you get to the chapter on this species, most of it is we don't know how many eggs they produce, or we don't know what they eat. Basically, we don't know anything about them. So that's been really great with our team because we have somebody checking on the ponds daily at the Springs Preserve. So we can document a lot of these new discoveries and understand the biology of the species a lot more.
This is super cool and fascinating. And also, as a non-scientist and animal lover, I was like, oh, when he talked about the mallards eating the frogs. And then, like Bronson was saying about fishing, I used to catch frogs when I was little. Bronson, you grew up here. Remember the smaller like detention basins? Is that what they were called? I don't know. I used to go down there and catch tadpoles and frogs. So I have a soft spot for frogs. But I guess that's the circle of life, right? Moving on here, Ray, I imagine that recreating a natural habitat and then introducing rare and endangered species also requires some permitting and coordination with other state and local government agencies. And I'm sure you and the team had to do a lot of research, which sounds like you guys are doing that constantly, planning and permitting before you can move forward. What does it take to restore these wetland habitats? And now that they have been recreated and the frogs and fish are introduced, what type of effort does it take to sustain or maintain these areas?
The permitting issue is quite complex because we're an active well field. Understandably, the operational people wanted to make sure that if we're putting a rare species on the site, this wouldn't impact operations at all. I worked on a document for the fish called the Safe Harbor Agreement. It's an agreement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It took 3 months to write, but it took 3 years to go through all the different departments and legal at U.S. Fish and Wildlife and back and forth and finally being authorized. And it was a similar process with the frogs, except it was called a Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. And that's for species that are not federally listed yet, but might be. That particular agreement was made between the Nevada Department of Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it affords us the same protections so that we can continue operations. And if in the future there was some reason we didn't want to do the project anymore, we have to take the number of fish and frogs back to the baseline level. So in another population, that might have been 120 frogs. In our case, it's 0 because they're not native to the site. So the agreement had to go through all of those steps, but that's where we ended up with all these partners. So we work closely, especially with the frogs. We work with our colleagues at UNLV. And then for the fish that are federally protected, we work with folks at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but also the boots on the ground that do a lot of the survey work are the Nevada Department of Wildlife. So those are our partners on the project primarily.
You got state partners, you got federal partners, we got academic partners. I mean, that really is what it takes to pull something like this off and be able to recreate a habitat and harbor these species here. And just amazing results with those numbers, the sheer volume of both fish and frogs that are now inhabiting that area. I mean, I got to say, that's got to feel pretty good being a biologist and all, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And another partner I should have mentioned as well is the Springs Preserve themselves. So they do all the husbandry. So their focus is on making sure the filtration is working, that bubblers are working in the ponds, the removing of the chara on a sort of ongoing basis. In the fall, we have tens of thousands of leaves that fall on the pond. So there's a lot of maintenance involved with keeping these ponds functioning properly.
So with all that maintenance and with all of these partnerships and the years of work that have gone in and the study and the research and the publication of papers, why do we do this? Why is it important to protect species like this? This is just a little frog and a little fish. Why do they matter?
So we get that question a lot in biology, especially when you're working with very rare species. One way I like to explain it is if you've ever played Jenga, the block tower, and if you have an ecosystem and you think of each block as part of the ecosystem, what had happened at the Springs Preserve and at sites like this is a bunch of blocks were removed and the tower was very unstable. So what we're doing is we're adding an amphibian, adding a fish, and even adding a reptile that we'll talk about in a bit.
So adding those species back really builds that, I guess, you're referring to Jenga, right? Like that's an ecosystem tower, right? For, I guess, lack of a better term.
Exactly. Yeah. So it basically, our systems are recreated, but a natural system, what it does is filters water. If you're out down at the Wash or at Warm Springs Natural Area, another place we maintain, some of these areas are filtering our water. They're removing sediment. They're doing a lot of functions that help clean the water for us in advance of our sort of filtration at our plants.
So another favorite to those that are here in the desert and love the desert is the desert tortoise. And we have a habitat at the Springs Preserve that's located on the trails near the old Big Spring house. The desert tortoise is another species at the preserve that's considered endangered. Tell us a little bit about the desert tortoise habitat and what is it and why is the tortoise an important species to protect?
The actual level of protection for it is threatened, but generally speaking, considered endangered. The desert tortoise is one of these species that is crucial to an ecosystem. We call them ecosystem engineers, sort of like beavers that create dams. The tortoise, on the other hand, they create thermal refuges for lots of other species. One tortoise might have up to 60 burrows on the landscape, so they're not using them all at the same time. So these burrows are used by rodents, invertebrates, even birds like burrowing owls, and we've seen a roadrunner poke into one of them. So when it's really hot, like this past summer when it was 120, a lot of species can get down in these underground burrows that these tortoises have been making all over the landscape. That was one of the first ones we wanted to bring back, the desert tortoise, just because it's so important to the ecosystem and so many other species. At the Springs Preserve, what we did is we created a 15-acre habitat and we fenced it with tortoise fencing and created this huge area. And then we got a few tortoises. One of those tortoises is Mojave Max, and he's part of a conservation education program for school children. The whole idea is kind of like Groundhog Day. It's to guess when the tortoise is going to come out. So our tortoises have radio telemetry transmitters on their shells so we can track them around the site. Also, we have a camera on whichever burrow Mojave Max has spent the winter on so that we can tell which day he will walk out of his burrow. And there's some rules and stuff, and then the children can guess on which day, and if they guess the right day, then there's field trips and other related rewards to having guessed which day he decided that it was spring and was coming out of his burrow.
Mojave Max is great. It also allows teachers to now incorporate some of this biological conversation and education into their classroom, but Mojave Max really makes it tangible for those school-aged kids. Now, listen, before we wrap up, we've been talking about the ecosystem tower. We've talked about protecting the various species, the amphibians, the fish, the reptiles. With all of that, some of us have pets at home, be it a goldfish or a reptile. And we get to a point where maybe, we're unable to care for that pet anymore. I already know the answer to this, but I'm just going to ask it for our listeners. Is it a good idea to go ahead and add that goldfish to the ecosystem tower of Lake Mead, or to add that boa constrictor to the ecosystem tower here in the Mojave Desert and just turn them loose?
No, actually, it's really, really, really bad. I can't emphasize how bad it is to release them. In some cases, just for the animal itself. We've heard of guinea pigs being released in the desert, that kind of thing. They're just not going to make it. And there's a whole bunch of predators, coyotes, bobcats, that kind of thing. The other thing is in some species, like goldfish, they can tend to survive. And if they breed, they can outcompete native species. There was a situation in the valley where somebody released mosquito fish and crayfish into a population where there were Pahrump Poolfish. And there were 10,000 Pahrump Poolfish. And they went from 10,000 fish. 2 years later, after the introduction of the crayfish and the mosquito fish, we were down to about 300 fish. So it absolutely collapsed the population. The fish ate the larvae, and when the adult Pahrump Poolfish were sleeping in the wintertime and dormant, The crayfish weren't, and were just walking around and just grabbing them and eating them. So it was kind of a 1-2 punch, catching the adults that were reproducing and also taking out the recruitment. So that particular pond had to be pumped dry, and it took 18 months of keeping it dry just to kill off those crayfish that are from Louisiana. And then once it was dry, then they had to put up a fence, and now the public can't go to the pond because, somebody just did the wrong thing and ruined it. That population that went from 10,000 to 300, we're back at square one, and we got to build up that population again. There are websites like Don't Let It Loose that give more information on both the laws, but also on some ideas as to where you can bring these pets. So tropical fish, best place to go is fish pet shops. Same with the reptiles. There's also the SPCA. There's various organizations that can take these animals. Even tortoises, we don't allow people to release their pet desert tortoises in the desert because desert tortoises carry a disease called URTD. It's upper respiratory tract disease. And it is so contagious that one tortoise with it will wipe out about 95% of the tortoises in the area. It's just lethal to them, absolutely lethal. So it's always a bad idea.
So as a pet owner, it's got to be responsible. If you have an unwanted pet, visit don'tletitloose.com, the Nevada SPCA, referencing exotic fish stores or reptile stores. If you have an unwanted exotic fish or reptile, don't turn it loose. You obviously want to care for that animal. Turning it loose is not a safe location for them or for any other species in the area. Ray Saumure, thank you so much for joining us here on the Water Smarts podcast and making us a little bit smarter about reptiles, amphibians, and fish.
Thank you very much, Bronson and Crystal. I hope you learned a lot today, and thank you for really letting me share what we're doing. We're pretty excited about it.
Great work, Ray.
Thank you.
Crystal, great information there. It's silly how much I love hearing about like frogs and fish, and it's so awesome we get the opportunity to talk about it.
I know, frog and fish. But it is super cool. I mean, I just, as a like I've said earlier, as a non-science person, just hearing the dedication and the research and the work that goes into, repopulating these species. And I don't know, it's super cool. And I loved how he explained everything to us, and just awesome work that they're doing there. It's incredible to hear.
Yeah. And when we hear about all of that work, protecting these species, revitalizing these species, giving them a safe place, we should also say, we talked a little bit about it at the end, as far as if you have an unwanted pet, the Springs Preserve is not the place to bring an unwanted pet, regardless of the species. They don't accept any species unless you've got a safe harbor agreement that took you 3 years to develop and had to get signed by multiple agencies. Keep that in mind. If you've got an unwanted pet, a pet you can't care for anymore, Google is a great resource to you. You can just Google rehoming pets Las Vegas. Lots of options there. Some of those websites that we talked about during the interview with Ray are available. That is the best way to go so that you can make sure that those pets continue to have a happy life. Even if it's not with you, it will give them the best chance for survival. Well, that's it for this episode here on the Water Smarts podcast. We hope you subscribe and listen to us next time. And if you like the show, give us a rating. It'll help us reach more of your neighbors here in Southern Nevada. And if you would like more information about conservation, water quality, new technologies, and everything that you need to know to be water smart, you can find tips, videos, and lots of resources on our website at SNWA.com. That's SNWA.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you here next time on Water Smarts.